Hello, I'm Bob McMaster. Welcome to this, the second in a series of Zoomcasts on the life and legacy of Edward Hitchcock. This one entitled Edward Hitchcock's Fossil Footmarks. In March of 1835, Professor Edward Hitchcock of Amherst College received a letter from a Dr. James Dean of Greenfield, describing what the doctor suspected were bird tracks in a slab of sandstone from a nearby quarry. In the slabs of sandstone from Connecticut River in Montague or Sunderland, lately brought here, I have obtained singular appearances, new to me, although I presume not to yourself. One of them is distinctly marked with the tracks of a turkey in relief. I do not know, but they may be familiar to you. But if you desire it, I will endeavor to prevent their being converted to the use for which they were brought here. A few days later, Professor Hitchcock penned this reply. I am not without strong suspicion that the case you mention may be a very peculiar structure of certain spots in the sandstone, which I have often seen in a red variety of that rock. The layers of rock having this structure sometimes present an appearance resembling the foot of a bird, but I am satisfied that it is not the result of organization, that is, of a living thing, though I confess myself unable to say precisely from what principle it has resulted. But perhaps the case you mention is not of this sort. I should be quite glad to see these specimens. If you can prevent their being defaced for a month or two until I shall visit Greenfield, I shall be much obliged to you. A few weeks later, the professor traveled to Greenfield by horse and buggy to see those sandstone slabs for himself. It was clear that the marks were made by animals, most likely by birds or bird-like creatures. They consist of two slabs, he wrote, about 40 inches square, originally united face to face, but on separation, presenting four most distinct depressions on one of them, with four correspondent projections on the other, precisely resembling the impressions of the feet of a large bird in mud. Hitchcock was astonished. He'd grown up in Deerfield, less than 4 miles from the quarry where these rocks were found. Furthermore, he had traveled thousands of miles over the previous 4 years, crisscrossing Massachusetts, surveying the state's geological resources. How could it be, he must have wondered, that he himself had never seen anything like these specimens before? He immediately set aside all his other projects and began an intensive search up and down the Connecticut Valley for similar tracks in stone, covering more than 500 miles in barely 6 months. He talked to quarrymen, rockhounds, landowners, anyone who had any experience with such curious rock samples. To his amazement, he also observed slabs of rock with similar marks on the steps of Hampshire County Courthouse in Northampton and on the sidewalks of Greenfield and Deerfield. Barely 9 months after receiving that initial letter from Dr. Dean, Hitchcock published this article in the American Journal of Science, Ornithechnology, Description of the Footmarks of Birds, Ornithechnites, on New Red Sandstone in Massachusetts. Clearly and precisely, he described the tracks he had found and the settings in which they had occurred. The article included 2 large illustrations by his wife, Ora White Hitchcock. He then presented his conclusions. First, these impressions are evidently the tracks of a biped animal, for I have not been able to find an instance where more than a single row of impressions exists. Number two, they could not have been made by any other known biped except birds. On this point, I am happy to have the opinion of more than one distinguished zoologist. And number three, they correspond very well with the tracks of modern birds. He also presented a taxonomy of the tracks, arguing that there were 7 species and several subspecies represented in 2 groups, the Pachydactyly and the Leptodactyly. He named the entire group Ornithognites from the Greek, meaning birds in stone. His avian hypothesis that these were the tracks of ancient birds was very controversial in several respects. First, the tracks occurred in ancient sandstone that would suggest that birds were present on Earth hundreds of millions of years earlier than paleontologists had previously believed. But even more strikingly, some of these tracks were enormous, upwards of 18 inches long, even bigger than the track of an ostrich. As we might expect, Hitchcock's paper generated a great deal of interest among paleontologists, both in America and abroad. Several reviews in European journals were very enthusiastic. A Swiss reviewer wrote, "It seems impossible to doubt that these footprints are the footsteps of birds walking on the sandstone." A German reviewer writing in a journal called the Archive of Natural History wrote, "Much of a stir was rightly made by the bird tracks discovered by Hitchcock on the shores of the Connecticut and Massachusetts. There is no doubt that this is really to do with bird footprints." Over the next few years, Hitchcock secured the support of 3 influential European paleontologists, William Buckland, Charles Daubeny, and Sir Charles Lyell. Curiously, few American reviews appeared in the first few years, but at a meeting of the Association of American Geologists in Philadelphia in 1840, a vigorous discussion followed Hitchcock's presentation of his findings. The minutes of that meeting state that the fossil footmarks were, quote, "of so much interest as to induce the association to appoint a committee to visit the localities and to report their conclusions at the next meeting." That blue ribbon committee, consisting of these 5 well-known American geologists, spent a year deliberating the matter. 2 of the members traveled to Amherst, examined the large number of specimens Hitchcock had by then collected, and visited several of the localities where they were dug with Hitchcock. At the next meeting of the association in April of 1841, the committee submitted their report. "From a comparative examination of the facts on both sides, your committee unanimously believe that the evidence entirely favors the views of Professor Hitchcock." Over the next 20 years, Hitchcock continued to seek out new localities and new specimens of fossil footmarks. He devoted a good deal of effort to working out the taxonomy of the tracks, concluding by 1858 that there were in the vicinity of 130 distinct species. He published some 17 scholarly papers and 2 books on the footmarks. Despite the support he enjoyed among paleontologists and all those publications, Hitchcock came in for considerable criticism and even some ridicule then and into the 20th century. Science historian Dennis R. Dean, in a 1969 article in American Quarterly, wrote, "Hitchcock is the last significant geological theorist who dabbles, who creates, who imagines, and the grand assurances, the flights of pious imagination which characterize his works are tragic in their obsolescence. How unfortunate," said he and many other critics, "that Edward Hitchcock insisted on his avian hypothesis." Well, my research tells me that Hitchcock did not insist on that avian hypothesis. He favored it, to be sure, simply because it was the best explanation he could find for the evidence he observed. But he asserted again and again that it was not the only possible explanation of these tracks. In a report published in 1841, he wrote, "Living analogies lead us to conclude that most of them are the tracks of birds. But there is plausibility enough in the opposite conjecture to justify the use of terms that imply resemblance rather than actual identity." In a speech before the AAG in 1843, he wrote that there may have been animals in the red sandstone period of a different class, say reptiles, with feet so exactly like our present birds as some of the tracks on stones seem to be. It is easy to imagine. In his book, Ichnology of New England in 1858, he wrote, "I speak of those animals as certainly birds, though doubts sometimes cross one's mind on this point. And I am aware that with some distinguished zoologists, these doubts are strong. But I follow what seems to me at present the most probable view." And finally, in the proceedings of the American Association of Arts and Sciences in 1862, he wrote, "The facts, however, do show us that the quadrupeds of sandstone days had strong ornithic characters, and they justify the conclusion that if none of the animals had made the tracks were veritable birds, they approached very near them in character." Why, some 20th century critics asked, did Hitchcock not recognize these as the tracks of dinosaurs? The answer is simply this: because nobody knew anything about dinosaurs in his day, not in the modern sense of that term. The word had been coined in 1841 by this man, Sir Richard Owen. But the creatures that word originally described would not have been capable of making those tracks. They were very different from what we call dinosaurs today, more like alligators with 4 short legs and plantigrade feet like ours, not digitigrade feet like birds. But today we know much more about dinosaurs, and especially in the last 50 years or so, a new view of dinosaurs has emerged. And what it tells us is that the dinosaurs of long ago were in fact the ancestors of modern day birds. Martin Lockley of the University of Colorado wrote in 1991, "Hitchcock was right all along. The tracks were indeed those of special types of bird, not creatures identical to modern turkeys, but their ancient theropod ancestors." And Robert T. Baker, the distinguished American paleontologist and dinosaur expert, has written, "Hitchcock was the earliest, in many ways, the best mind in dinosaur science. All of us 21st century students of the dinosaur-bird relations owe a tip of the hat toward the Reverend Edward Hitchcock." So Edward Hitchcock's reputation as a paleontologist has been resurrected. Clearly, in his avian hypothesis, he was much more right than wrong. Edward Hitchcock was far from a revolutionary. If anything, he was a conservative at heart, clinging steadfastly to established notions in matters both scientific and spiritual. Yet in his research and writing on the fossil footmarks, he almost single-handedly created a new discipline, ichnology, a subdiscipline, ornithichnology. He discovered dozens of species entirely new to science, never even hinted at by the paleontological researchers on several continents. And his findings pushed back the time of the earliest evidences of avian life on Earth by hundreds of millions of years. In the next Zoomcast in the series, I'll explore Edward Hitchcock's spiritual journey and his efforts to convince other clergy, scientists, and the general public that science and religion need not be adversaries. If you want more information, I hope you will read my book. All the Light Here Comes From Above, The Life and Legacy of Edward Hitchcock. You might also enjoy visiting my website, www.edwardhitchcock.com, where you will find much more information on the man and on the book. Thank you very much for joining me today.